Hey, welcome back for another episode of the Eh-Soteric Archives. Very happy to be here today. I'm Andrew.
I'm Mike.
And we got a super special guest. This comes from a mutual friend of ours here. And our guest has been involved in the media space for a long, long time and is very well versed in kind of, Canadian media and media as a whole. So, I'm not going to waste too much time. I'll throw it over to Joe here and let him introduce himself. Joe, thanks for jumping on today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Joe.
Yeah, thank you both for having me on. It's nice to talk to some fellow Canadians for a change. Most of the shows that I've done are with Americans, and it's nice that we have kind of like maybe some shared back and forth about what we see in Canadian media, where it's not often as prominent with our neighbors to the south. I mean, introduction-wise, I've been basically, and you could say kind of the media consciousness transformation world since about 2009 with the creation of our primary platform, which is Collective Evolution. That was kind of birthed out of this inspiration to, at the time I was recognizing there was a lot of stuff going on in the world that was really kind of changing the way I saw the world. My world views were being questioned. I was questioning why I thought the way I did about things. I was also going through a lot of personal transformation in working on just my own belief systems and working through trauma and working through, kind of the ways in which we develop our worldview as a person. And I kind of felt like the world was kind of at a bit of a turning point. And I still think that that's here now, and it's even louder now than back in 2009. And the idea of Collective Evolution was to discuss the multiple aspects of this turning point, from the way we relate to ourselves, the way we relate to each other, the way we relate to society, the way we relate to nature. What is the nature of who we are and why we're here, perhaps? Why are the systems that we have, that we live within in society, why are they functioning the way they are? Are there truths about them that maybe we're not kind of clear on as a society? And what happens when we question all of this stuff and do so in a way ultimately that embraces curiosity and embraces a sense of neutrality, which is to say, instead of just getting really upset one way or another, or instead of, becoming, let's say, really active on one side or another of something, if we just say, well, what really is going on and how do we discuss this maturely where, we can come together, what would happen if we did that? And that was kind of like the, why Collective Evolution started. It went from articles to documentaries to podcasts to videos, all the fun stuff over the years. And and then we birthed out into another platform called The Pulse, which was really kind of focusing a little bit more on investigative media specifically for a little while. And now I'm kind of actually just back more focusing on Collective Evolution, because I think now more than ever, we're at a time where so many of the topics we discussed early on are really, really relevant. Versus back in the day, it was kind of like it was rare and it was a bit fringy to discuss things like, let's say 9/11, or discussing how the media might have manipulative narratives, or whether or not there's lobbyist or deep state control of various policies within government, or the fact that, big corporations are ultimately perhaps misleading people with science, or not really putting forth the truth about how their products might hurt people or hurt nature. All this stuff is like front and center now, and I think there's just a much greater appetite for it. So yeah, it's just been exciting to try and enter back in with a whole, let's say, almost like what is the next cutting edge thing to talk about now that we've brought, let's say, as a collective, we've come to this understanding that there is something worth talking about here.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's it's interesting that you say that, because so when I first found your work, it was actually through The Pulse, because that's where our mutual friend Nicole was working for you at the time.
Yeah.
And that was back in like the 2020 days. So I was, I had always been, I was never like a huge news guy. I didn't really. I've kind of, my dad raised me to sort of question things, and I was raised on. I always
Yeah.
say I was raised on George Carlin and the Beatles, so I had, like, spiritual aspect, and then the don't trust anyone kind of thing going. So when I found your work, what I really loved about it was I felt like in the space there wasn't anything that was as unbiased as what you were doing. It was sort of this 30,000 foot top view down on everything, and how we need to sort of like separate ourselves from this team and group narrative,
Mhm.
um stop taking sides and look at things in a more of a critical way, using more critical thinking, not critiquing everything, but actual critical thinking. And um, yeah, I love that about your articles. If anyone that looks up Joe's stuff with collective evolution, there's every article starts with that little blurb that you have that's like, take a minute, breathe, put your hand on your heart, and just like center yourself before entering into this space of
Yeah.
opinions. And I think that's really kind of a beautiful thing. So yeah,
Yeah.
I love the way you've approached it in the past and moving forward. And it's interesting too that I didn't realize you started this in 2009. Like
Mhm.
that was a different world.
Oh, yeah.
What obviously you felt a calling to get into it, but what were you working in like mainstream media before and then transitioned into this, or how did that come about?
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate the thoughts on some of what we've done there over the course of time, and I think some of the things you mentioned just before I answer the question, I think are really cool parts that I hope we can maybe dive into a little bit more deeply. Which is that piece we put on the website, which we actually started back in 2016, and there's a whole like survey and stuff we can talk about with regard to that later on. But what was I doing in 2008, 2009 when I was kind of like getting into this? I mean, I came out of so I'm 38 now. So I was like 21 or 22, I think, when I was like getting started with CE. And I pretty well was in and out of like coming out of high school, I was in and out of post-secondary programs. I kept not wanting to be in post-secondary school. I love to learn. I love to exercise my mind. I like to do all these things, but I did not like the structure of education. And nothing against it from the standpoint of if other people like it, have at her. For me, it just wasn't where I wanted to learn. And so I was kind of in and out of programs. I'd start one, I'd drop out. I'd start one, I'd drop out.
Yeah.
And a lot of this was, having personal pressure from the people around you who are worried for you. Your parents and your family, they want the best for you, so they're kind of really pushing you to go to school and do these sorts of things because, yeah, it kind of makes sense to an extent. I get it, but for me, the final dropping out of of post secondary school was the moment that really began to shift the way I lived my life, which was now I'm going to live my life on the terms of I'm going to listen to myself because that voice was always there. But sometimes you'd have these like fears or these worries about how other people around you would respond based on living life off the beaten path the way you would want to. But once I made that choice, that kind of strung a series of events together where I started to meet people that thought differently, and it almost like created mentorship circles where other people who were thinking differently than, let's say, the beaten path, I was now in regular contact with, and it taught me a lot about uh, personal development, taught me a lot about sort of like nurturing different ways of seeing the world. And there's so many authors and amazing, incredible people out there over the years who've offered different ways of seeing the world. But when you get to kind of like sit with people who've lived life and hear from them about how they've lived that way and how they navigate the world, this can be a great opportunity to continue to expand this way of thinking. And so that was kind of the beginning of it for me. And at the time I was working in IT as I would sort of drop out of, these various post-secondary programs. Wasn't doing anything, let's say, overly special, but doing what I needed to do to make money and contribute to my community and however that looked like. And the more steam I built up on questioning things, the more it became clear that I wanted to create a space for more of this type of dialogue. for more of this type of exploration of different ways of seeing the world. And that, of course, was coupled with this very, very strong feeling that we're at this time where human consciousness is shifting. It's like, it's been prophesized through various prophecies that, now or in and around now is a time where this would happen. You can just look at the ways in which we are moving through a revolution of sorts. It's in the mainstream through Klaus Schwab. They call it the fourth industrial revolution, right? And what he's ultimately pointing to is the fact that we've reached a point in, you could argue, system collapse as well as technological advancement that is forcing a radical change in the way that we're living. And when you have a change that is that large, it doesn't just affect economy and what becomes available, but it affects how we derive meaning, how we see ourselves, how we see our purpose, how we see each other, nations. Like, all these elements are coming together at once. And so, when I look back to the early days of, I had this inkling and this feeling that, yeah, there's this big shift in consciousness, that's this mass change which happens over time in the way humans see themselves and see each other. And when I think about that, and I think about, on a systemic level, what we're actually seeing happen in our world, I'm like, yeah, these things go hand in hand.
Mhm.
Because you can't not address these deeper questions of who we are, why we're here, in without, looking at what we're doing on a day-to-day basis, and vice versa, right? They're feeding into each other. So yeah, just to, I guess, go back to answering the question direct, it's like what I was doing at the beginning was, in and out of school, work in IT, and changing my mind. And that brought into, that went into the whole journey back then.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's yeah, you mentioned that and I think everyone feels it right now, that this sort of shift in our reality, down to the, like, day-to-day things,
Yep.
like technology that we're using, and you're seeing such a split. And there was a point when I was kind of diving into some of the new age stuff. It was pretty short-lived, but the things I took that resonated from that were sort of the idea of this ascension process and this, like, bifurcation. And I know it's, like, very sci-fi in that world of how they view it, but if you actually, like, extrapolate that to real life, there
Hmm.
very much is a bifurcation of what's happening right now, and people do need to find a way to bring what's going to be aligned into the future with them. And I think there's, you do see that split between people. There's a large group of people that would love to go back to the old days, the old ways of doing things, and I just don't see that as possible.
Mm.
you know Humanity moves forward always,
Yeah.
what for better or worse sometimes, and things come in
Hmm.
waves, and but yeah, like, so I think, and again, that's something I like about your writing and stuff, is you don't take this, like, uh overly critical view of technology and things, like, there's some people that are very against AI, very against all these advancements, and I definitely think we need to be conscious of how we're approaching this and how much we're letting it affect our lives. But at the same time, like, the control is in our hands. We decide where this goes, right? Like, we
Yeah.
we decide how we integrate these things into our life. So, um, yeah, I think that there's it's just neat that you were seeing this back in 2009, and here we are almost 20 years later, and it's only been amplified, right? Like, I feel like we're
Hmm.
just really getting into it now.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, and then I used to read different books and stuff, because there wasn't a ton online in 2009, but you'd read the books and the authors who had been seeing this for the last like 20 years, and I'm looking at it going, man, you were seeing this like for a while, right? And some of them,
Yeah.
it goes
Mhm.
way back, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's always people seeding different ideas, and I just feel like now we're at sort of the physical moment where a lot of it's playing out. And yeah, I just think from a, when we think about the ways in which we try to go about writing it, like, this was a big part of the approach and the kind of the purpose around why we did CE the way we did it so early on. Was it was like, if we're truly interested in creating a better world, it's like, this isn't necessarily about activism in the way that we might traditionally understand activism, which is like, I get I get down and heavy for a cause, and I fight for that cause, and I see perhaps my cause in a narrow view, and I try to bring a solution to that narrow thing. But how do we know that that solution isn't affecting a whole bunch of other things negatively, right? Because oftentimes, activism can do that. We have the best of intentions to solve a singular issue, not realizing all the potential issues it might create throughout the rest of the system. And so by nature, you got to take this step back when we're talking about something this big and go, well, hold on a second. We are humans living in a human society. Those are both complex systems. Complex systems are hard to predict. And, so the more we can slow down, the more we can take a look at what's going on, the better chance we have. And when there's an environment of, back then the polarization wasn't as bad, the division wasn't quite as bad. It was there, it probably always has been, but it wasn't as, let's say, in our face. And having the language that you're kind of referring to, where it's like, look, we're taking a look, we're trying to see what's going on, is, in my view, and why we took this culture, is kind of like the best effort to actually create the conditions for people to want to listen. It doesn't mean everybody will. It doesn't mean everybody will see the world the way we see it, and that's not really the point. And it doesn't mean that people aren't still going to get mad when you challenge various ideas, but you're removing all the potential barriers that can create it and make it harder to actually have conversations and come together. And that approach was kind of a big part of what we tried to model and what we tried to do, and it's what fed into, the like not just the content that we tried to cover, but then the way we tried to do it and the mechanisms like we put in place. Like the purpose of that thing at the top of the article was to kind of invite people to pause for a second, create a little bit more coherence essentially between the heart and the brain, where there would be a little bit more physiological coherence, where the mind is actually working a little bit better and the emotions are potentially slightly more regulated. If someone does that and does it for 60 seconds, yeah, they're giving themselves a little bit of a chance to slow down. It also gives them the opportunity to actually take a pause in their day, where oftentimes we're just smashing through content. We're going from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, right? And when you see this thing and like, you're like, well, what is this? Like, okay, maybe I'll think about this for a sec. Should I do this? Should I not? Like, this is kind of what I think people do when they see that thing. And the people who read us more, they start doing it more often. Um, I think it makes an attempt to create conditions for just a little bit more good faith in the way that we look at things and the way that we try to understand the way we feel about something. Because when we get triggered, it doesn't mean that the other person's wrong. It could be that I'm getting triggered because something about this bothers me. And the only way to solve that is I have to be aware of why I'm getting triggered by a piece of content and what belief systems or what is driving my reaction to it.
Yeah.
Sometimes it could be a totally correct reaction. There's nothing wrong with that. And other times it's an opportunity to say, hey, do I need to be this upset about something, or do I need to hold on to whatever it might be? But, that awareness has to be there. And the goal of that thing was to offer regular readers um, the ability to practice something and see if it made a difference when you read 2-3 articles in a day, or you're continually doing this week over week. And we actually did run a survey in 2020 that we released the results of, because we had put that on the website, I believe in 2016, late 2016. And so we had like a good 3.5-ish years of having millions and millions and millions of people see that. And we went to essentially like 1,500 of our most regular readers, and we asked them to answer like a series of questions about how that, not only that thing, but how the language we use in our articles and the way we get people to ask questions, how that affects a whole multitude of things when it comes to our work. So how does it affect them emotionally? Does it still inform them? How does it compare to the mainstream when they look at media? How does it compare to other folks in alternative and independent media? Ultimately, is it serving to like actually help them understand things, right? And there was a bunch of other questions, but what we ultimately found was that people had, by and large, a significantly easier time navigating controversial subjects without feeling burnt out, without feeling hopeless, without feeling like they were being invited into rage and being angry, right? So the purpose, the point that I took away from that, amongst a whole bunch of other results, was that ultimately, like, we can talk about difficult things. It's a question of how we choose to talk about them, and how do we choose to repeatedly talk about them. So not just once where I put in a good faith effort, but to do it regularly. And it creates a situation where I think ultimately we do have an easier time exploring things that normally would get people upset, than they'd want to avoid it and not look at it and be like, that's just negative, I don't want to go there. But if you do it in a different way, you can talk about these things. And I think now in our world, when I look at how much more hyperbolic and how much more polarizing it is than it was before, and then I look at the influencers of today, and this isn't to pick on them, but to say, yeah, a lot of influencers today are either hard and fast down a political side. Sometimes there can be religious motivation built into that as well, which shapes perspective. And then on top of that, there can be a ton of anger or a ton of upset or a ton of rage that not only builds audience, but it normalizes all of that. And that was kind of our offering. Here's a model, a way of doing something that works, and take it or leave it. And I think we see that although we were really popular back then, I don't think the trend caught on, but I still think that that's where we need to go. We need to go to a place where we can have media that's like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of people say that talk about how terrible the news has gotten, how everything's just slop now, but I actually kind of disagree with that statement. I think it's actually very sophisticated in the way that they approach. I
Yeah.
hadn't watched mainstream news for a couple of years, and then my wife's parents were visiting and they threw it on, and it was scored. Like, there was music to one of the segments, and I was like, when did this start?
What?
Like, this is that. But again, like, they know what triggers people. They know how to invoke emotion. Like, there's a reason that that film and television uses, certain tones in different scenes. It's not music, it's just tones. It's frequency, right? They know how to hit a nerve, and
Yeah.
they know who their audience is, and they've gotten far more sophisticated in how they approach that audience. And I think that's why you're seeing people so like stuck in their ways, where you say, like, this approach hasn't really caught on yet. It's because it's being countered with a
Oh
very
yeah.
sophisticated counter campaign, right? So,
Mhm.
Yeah.
um, where do you? I mean, so obviously a lot of this stuff, but most people can kind of trace this back to like 2020 and the last 5 years of really it being so in your face. But I guess back to 2016 from Trump's first presidency, right? That's when I really started to notice that. I was like, oh man, we're on a narrative train now. Like, this is
Yeah.
there's no independent thought going on. You pick your side, you stick to that side, and that's what people are doing.
That tribe up.
Yeah, yeah, right. And like, so is that kind of being in it, 10 years prior to that? Is that when you first, was it a stark difference? Was it a massive shift? And I guess, do you see it as being a coordinated effort, or is this just an evolutionary kind of thing? Like, what's going on?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, on the evolutionary front, I think anything we're experiencing is a possible catalyst for evolution, right? It's a question of whether or not we perceive it that way. But anything that happens, whether on purpose or by accident, is the potential for us to change and think differently as human beings. When I look at that 2016, 2017 period in time, it's very important because, you know, that was the Trump Hillary election that didn't necessarily go the way I think a lot of people thought.
Mhm.
I would say that was the beginning of what we often refer to as overt censorship in a lot of Western countries and through social media. By overt, I mean this was the first time we were seeing like mass changes in the way they were, big tech companies were ousting brands and shadow banning brands and doing some really aggressive stuff, which we can unpack a little bit. But I think also to understand this, I often refer to how power works, or how the power structure itself works. In my mind, is not necessarily that there's this singular entity that we might call the cabal or the deep state, and it's just this singular power that controls everything, let's say. I actually think it's more similar to maybe how you would view the mafia families of New York, where you have these, top 5 families, let's say, that all are playing this game of organized crime, and at one point you might have one of the families who has the majority of the power, and the other ones are okay, it's fine, business as usual, but eventually there's warring that happens between those you know families of power, if you will. And I honestly think it's probably how world power works as well. You have these powerful, massive dynasties that have been around for just, since the beginning of time almost. And they have power. They largely collaborate. They largely do things together because it kind of benefits the power that they all kind of hold and the wealth they all hold. But over periods of time, yeah, I do think they have rifts and they have differences. And if you believe in the soul and you believe in evolutionary development as a soul and as a collective, then you would also say that, even those powerful families are changing and evolving and growing and, moving through periods of time where they're not going to be the same as they always were. Plus, it's like we're in this role or this role playing game of life that where we evolve collectively, which means like the role they have would also change and evolve over the course of time. So to see them having, you know, their own wars and their own, let's say, upsetting of power, where someone's going to say, we're going to go out and take the mob boss out of this family over here, and then the two of our families are going to try and topple this massive New York family and become the new leaders, right? I think that kind of stuff is exactly what we see happening in world power, and I think to some extent, as much as the argument of it could be theater between what happened between the Hillary side and the Trump side, and it's all just one thing. It could also be that this is legitimately different subsets of power that are fighting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there might be something to that. And that feeds into what I'm about to say, which is I think to some extent what happened in that 2016 election might have been sort of the first time you might have been seeing a fracture where no longer could the mainstream media have, let's say, so much overt control over public narrative that they could get the results that they want. I'm not saying mainstream media is sitting there thinking this, but I mean the way owners of mainstream media sort of push those organizations to storytell. I think that type of social engineering was starting to lose the power that that it once had. And so in that fracturing of power began this now rocky, tumultuous period between 2016 and now, which I actually think it's coming down now, and it has been for the last couple of years. But this overt censorship, this ousting of brands, this ousting of voices, this shadow banning, demonetization, all of these things kind of began in and around 2016, 2017. And at the same time, I mean, as all of this was happening, yes, there was a more divisive, polarizing, pick your side, pick your tribe, what team are you gonna be on? Because I think things were starting to get chaotic.
Yeah.
And people needed to be louder in what they were doing in order to effectuate the type of mass, groups forming that they needed. And yeah, so I think there's a whole story that goes on there. I think social media has actually gotten a little bit better in recent years where the censorship and the fact checking, it's not as bad as it was.
No.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's not to say that it's perfect because we have algorithms and algorithms are a way of censorship, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
if I'm just pushing you down a path and showing you what you want all the time, I mean, you're not going to see everything.
Yeah.
Um, and in that way, it's sort of easy to kind of not really give people a balanced perspective because, again, why would a social media company that is designing their platform for max profit, max data collection, and max user ability, why would they do something that creates balance, right? They wouldn't do something that creates balance because then they might actually lose user base. so
Yeah. No,
so
totally.
even the system of commerce itself in that way is incentivizing these big tech platforms even before we get into, like, let's say, deep state influence. Just the system of commerce itself is saying, yeah, design your algorithms to create division. So there's all these layers through which we have a tumultuous and almost, you could say, just bad information landscape that is producing all of this division and all of these challenges that we have. But more and more people are becoming aware of it. I just hope that we kind of get to a point where the conscious choice becomes a little bit more everyday, meaning the rage bait is there, the algorithms are there, the desire, the invitation to follow all of the most, angry people, or let's say, um, not angry per se, but just they're trying to create reactions from people. People don't have to follow those people. They don't have to share that work, but they
Yeah.
do because we're just kind of doing that. And so I think we're at a moment where, as you mentioned earlier, we decide at the end of the day, we have the power. And so I think with all of this coalescing, the next stage is people going, hold on a second. It's not social media that's just keeping me in mind control constantly. It's just putting out an invitation. Do I accept that invitation? And I think that's what's next. And that's what I hope we come to as a species, is like realizing we need that conscious control back.
Yeah.
That's something I've definitely went through over the last couple of years. I'm a little less evolved in all this than Andrew here, but I was saying to him before, you're talking about algorithms. I was never on social media, been on Twitter for a couple of years. I've never even heard of you until a couple months ago. And you would think, given what I'm interested in, at some point it would have pushed your like collective evolution on me, or I would have seen it or something. But it was all the constant rage bait and things to get me angry. Luckily, met Andrew and kind of got me down a different path, I think, because those were things that did affect me. And and reading your articles now, I see how I was lucky to start kind of zooming out and step away. And why are these things bothering me? Like why? And to learn too that we do have a choice, and that's how I got out of it. Was like I don't have to follow. I'm not going to name the names. We know who they are.
Yeah.
But I don't have to follow these angry people. And it would you. I'd be like, yeah, that's right. Yeah, like, retweet, comment. I feel better. And then, but you don't.
It's just a dopamine response, right?
100%. Yeah. And it's hard. It's very hard when you're in the middle of it, because I felt very isolated from the rest of Canada for a while. And then I started to find things that resonated with me, and I got real angry, right? Like, and now I'm not. And I couldn't feel better about it, actually. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm starting to see that shift even in like older generations and stuff too. Like we had a conversation with a guy a couple months ago who was probably in his late 70s, and just the way he approached media was really interesting, because he basically said, like, you never know what to believe now. And we're like, yeah, no, you're right. It's hard to know what to believe. And then he was like, in my day, we had Walter Cronkite and you knew you could trust him. And it's just so like, your mind's open and you can see that, there's manipulation going on, but you're still on the centralization thing where, like, if only there was just a one central source that I could trust. And and that's where it really did. It struck me as an evolutionary thing, because it's like, this older generation, not to disparage them or say that, like, all seniors aren't going to be able to connect the dots, but there's a certain thought process where they can get to here and then it stops, and then the next generation can get to here, and then the next generation. And I work with some younger guys that are like in their early 20s and stuff, and they're putting pieces of the puzzle together that I didn't get until I was like, early 30s, and we're the same age. So this younger generation, if they can get past the hopelessness thing, I think that's their crutch, is that everything feels hopeless and expensive and out of reach and whatever. But they have this open mind that my generation, our generation, didn't necessarily have. I mean, I was in the music scene, so I was distracted with shows and tours and media. Like, my heroes were on MTV. So there is that attractiveness to that, but when you start to zoom out and realize how much control there is in every single aspect of media, that's music, film, the news, the radio, even like YouTube algorithms and things like that. it's just, yeah, it's, I don't know where I was necessarily going with that statement, but it's just interesting to me that how there seems to be this like line in the sand for each generation that they're not really willing to step over because it risks their comfort level in either what they know or just how they've, a lot of people built their life around these systems. They
Yep.
work in them. And like to your point with people that work in the media, I had a point where I'm like, oh, these guys are all like, useful idiots and what, that whole kind of negative spin on it when it's like, no, they're just attracted to having a cool job. They don't want to sit at a desk all day, every day and input numbers. They want to be on TV. They want to produce shows. They want to, be involved in something that feels greater than being a cog in the machine. And that's, that's, so I have a lot more empathy for people in media, I guess is what I'm trying to say now than I used to. And I just, yeah. So what are your thoughts on that, on how it's, I guess the counter campaign and against this open-mindedness, and how you see future generations, like what are the pros and cons of how media is changing?
Yeah. I've made some notes here, and I want to include what you
Sorry,
said
I was
there.
rant. It's been a ranty day for
no
me.
worries. The notes are essentially just different things I think we could hit here. Repeat the last part again. You were saying, how do I feel about sort of the media side of how it's changing and what the pros and cons might be?
Yeah,
Okay.
and and
Yeah.
how you see the younger generation sort of playing a part in this, and are they going to get sucked into the same,
Yeah, for sure.
And if I could just add, also, you mentioned earlier about there are certain people within the media, as you're in the world, that are kind of on that other side. Maybe that's not the right term, and don't even know it, think they're doing good. Do you think that those media members maybe their consciousness will shift a little bit and they'll realize the error of their ways, or maybe change the way they do things? Just to add to that. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of fun stuff to unpack here.
Sorry, man.
No worries. Okay, so the first thing I kind of want to maybe touch on is with regards to, like, a lot of change is happening, and you were talking about generations and how the generations are like, we'll come up to this point and then it might get a little hairy and maybe won't change much more than that. This goes to something we've often spoken about, which is like the capacity to change. How do we create the conditions within ourselves as people, and then ultimately within communities to change much more easily, much more flexibly, and much more quickly? Because, while people often refer to humans' inability, let's say, to change our mind quickly as this sort of like evolutionary trait of like, we're really biased people. We can't change. We're not great at that. Change has to take hundreds or thousands of years. That's just how we are. I don't agree with that. I think that as we have all the capacities within ourselves, it's just that we've built a culture and a way of life that is often so, let's say, built in survival, or even the thinking is built out of a physiology of survival, meaning we're battling each other in our narratives. The language we use is often we're battling each other. When do we battle? When we feel in survival, right? And so the point being here is that the first thing we need to do, I think, as a species, is increase our physiological capacity to feel well within the chaos. And this points to how easy it is. Like when we get on that train of social media, news, stress, it can be a circular, sort of draining, energy intensive, burnout type situation, because we slowly over time kind of become a little bit negative. That negativity is not just in our thinking, but it becomes how we feel, how our nervous system is now responding to the world, where perhaps it feels like a dangerous place and we need to figure out what the heck's going on and blah, 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 blah. And that search is, and that physiological underpinning is very energy demanding. And it's not just the thoughts, it's what the body is feeling. And when we're in that survival for too long, not only do we wire that survival as the norm, as the baseline, but we're just spending, massive amounts of energy doing so. So we get tired with it, but then we also start to see the world as this dangerous place, and everybody as our enemy, or other people as our enemy. And we've done that for a long time. And I think in ways, when you add in the fact that our world is hard to survive right now from a financial point of view, it's disconnected. There's not a lot of good social engagement that we have. We're losing this sense of meaning and purpose for why we're even doing what we're doing. That is all reducing capacity and resilience, right? You can add in that, look at our air, look at our water, look at our food. It's not the highest quality stuff. It's putting tax, burden on the body to have to, get all this stuff out. That adds to the lessening of capacity and resilience. So what we've done is we've effectively created an environment that is producing a very difficult situation for humans to actually thrive. And our capacity for change, I think, is connected to our ability to lessen the effects of all of those things. So if we are able to, if we can afford to, and of course this would be much better if we were doing it at the source, but if we can eat less food that's not great for us, if we can have cleaner water, if we can expose ourselves to cleaner air, if we have a better relationship with social media, with how we might go down these paths of just getting lost in these social media deep dives that make us feel like shit. If we're good at regulating our nervous system and getting trauma out of the system, that's actually making it so that there's even more burden on the system by holding on to things of our past that are creating load in our system of stress. We start looking at all of these various things and how we can live and feel better. What you begin to notice is that the ability for that person to change their mind more easily is increased dramatically. For them to be more curious, increased dramatically. And it's simply because within the nervous system itself, there's a particular branch that comes out, back of the head, comes into the face, and it's all up above the diaphragm. It's called the ventral vagus nerve. And this part is unique to mammals. And it essentially is what regulates all the ways in which we have speech, which we have our eye movements, which we have our facial movements. It's helping us connect and socially engage as people. And for humans to thrive, that portion of our nervous system has to be well toned and on regularly. Whereas so often we're experiencing maybe a bit of that, but a lot of like survival energy where we might feel angsty. We might feel a little bit like I need to defend or I need to worry about things. Or we might feel more of the survival portion of the parasympathetic side, which is that I feel really shut down. I have no motivation. Like, who fucking cares about anything? Like, life sucks. I feel hopeless, right? That's kind of the other sort of survival that a lot of people feel is when there's a lot of apathy, that's actually survival. It's the last ditch attempt for the body to preserve itself. And in that space, we don't have a lot of energy. We don't have a lot of care. And so many of us are walking around with low grades versions of these, and some of us medium grades and some of us high grades. And point being here is that if that ventral portion of the vagus nerve, that social engagement is well on board, is well toned, and really you're just doing a lot to help feed into that. Curiosity, play, learning becomes optimal in our being. Now, that's the physiological side. There is a mental side where we can learn to be better critical thinkers. We can learn how to spot our biases better, right? So there is a mental and physical side to kind of what I'm suggesting here. But ultimately, like this capacity to change, this capacity to have it so that we can actually learn more is, I think, our birthright. We're born as these beings that are flexible, and we've learned to not be flexible. And so I do think that as this message, let's say, grows, and as we focus on our own wellness and we focus on better ways of mentally approaching topics, and we create the physiological conditions for that, we will be able to change our minds, grow, change, and be flexible better and faster. But as you can tell, I mentioned a lot of things there that sounds like, man, that's a lot of things that we got to focus on and do as people, right? So it will take time, but I do believe that if we focus on this more, the process actually becomes easier, because with more capacity and resilience comes more ability to kind of continue to tackle some of the things to become more well. So that was important there on just kind of the capacity to change part. I do have a couple other points, but I wanted to see if you guys wanted to respond to that at all.
Well, it just made me think of, I'm having some mic issues right now, but it made me think of, like third world countries and stuff, and people like societies that seem to be stuck in that like survival mode kind of thing. And because you hear the argument from people like, well, why don't they just fix their society? Why don't they just like, you know, grow more food, like create infrastructure that works, etc. But it's like that physiological side of it is like, yeah, if your country's been stuck in that space for 100 years, well, you know, people are operating at that level, right? So it's going to take longer for that change. And I think the powers that be have sort of realized that. And it's like, well, if we keep these people in a low vibrational state, then, you know, we can effectively delay change, delay progress, stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's what it made me think of. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to add too, as someone who's, as I mentioned before, in the midst of going through it, the good thing about everything that you mentioned is as you go through it, you really notice a difference. Like the minute you zoom out, you notice it quicker every time, and it doesn't affect you the same way. Not that it's instantaneous, but it you know what I mean? It does. Yeah.
Yeah, it does make a difference. And then, you know, that also then makes a difference in the conversations you have and the energy you bring to the, you know, community you're around, and, you know, it becomes a beacon, a possibility and of change. Right. So I do think there's something really cool about that. And then this sort of feeds into the, you know, the media perspective of like, what is it like in mainstream media, and the people who are working there, and kind of like what's going on. And, you know, to some extent, I have contact with people who work in media, in mainstream media, but I also have contact with people who used to work in mainstream media, but still have all of their relationships with either high up people there or people who are like in the newsrooms. And especially during COVID, it was quite fascinating to hear so many different stories. And which we can touch on, but you know, one of the things is it often feels like to alternative communities that like everything in mainstream media is controlled. It's all like a lie. Like they're all getting a script and they're just reading off that script. And it's like, look, to some extent, there's a little bit of truth there. Sometimes there is a press release that goes out that every local media station repeats, and that's how you get those things, right? That we
those clips where it's
they don't even try to change the headlines.
Yeah, no, that's right. The whole Project Mockingbird stuff, right? Like,
Yes. And so there is an element of that. But, you know, often in media, it's like, first off, like most media organizations that are mainstream, I mean, they're going to hire and attract people that already believe in what that media organization is about and how it leans, right? So to some extent, that worker is there on good intentions and good faith, trying to do their best, right?
Yeah.
On top of that, you have a newsroom director who might be sort of like, you know, perhaps in on some meetings here and there that sort of sets, we're going to talk about this, or we're not going to talk about that. And, you know, you see this a lot in, you can almost imagine it, but you see it in TV shows and movies sometimes where, you know, it's like the person who owns the media organization has the ability to say to their team, like, hey, you know, make sure, like if I owned CBC, let's say, hey, make sure, you know, Doug, the newsroom director at CBC, knows that this is the stance we need to take on this. Because usually somebody who owns, and CBC is a little different because it's publicly funded, but someone who owns a media organization, it's like they have the ability to, they usually own a lot of other things, first of all. They have the ability to communicate with people to say, hey, here's kind of the narrative we want to benefit some of the other business and stuff that we own, right? It's not overt lying sometimes. Usually it's narrative spinning. It's little small things here and there. So like that level of control happens. But during COVID, for example, you know, you had well-intentioned people sitting in that newsroom doing what they're trying to do. And some of them, yeah, from what I understand, they started to figure out that something wasn't right with all of the bits of the narrative. But everybody was too afraid to say something in front of everybody because they worried for, am I going to get fired? Am I going to get laughed at? Am I going to whatever? And they only started to figure out that they were all thinking different things when they were eventually out of the office, you know, talking amongst themselves about like how they don't feel comfortable pitching stories that are probably worth talking about, but nobody wants to do it. And then on top of that, I heard a story of one of the high up producers at CBC who revealed to my friend, yeah, we know full well, this was like, closer to the end of COVID. We know full well we've not really been doing journalism here at the CBC for the last, year and a half. Like they're fully aware that that's what's been happening. But to them, they're going, I'm in my job. We're all freaking towing a line, right? We're trying to make sure that in this time of upheaval that our families are fed, that I don't lose my job. It's going to be hard, and people will say, well, yeah, that's terrible because look at the harm you're causing. You should just stand up for the truth and do your thing. I can hear that argument as well, but there's also this element of, but that is real for that person. They do have to feed their family. It's not a good time to lose your job. It's not. So the point here is that you put people in really difficult situations and you force them, just like with vaccine mandates, to choose making a decision that is really true to yourself as a person or losing your ability to work. And then you can't support you and your family. Like this is in many ways during a time of chaos. This is how the media was controlled into doing what they were doing in some ways, is they were kind of all afraid of saying what was obvious. To be fair, look at how many people over the last 5 years have left mainstream media and gone and done independent work. And look at how much their tone has changed.
Mhm.
It's not perfect, let's say. They're not suddenly like the biggest truth tellers in the world, but if you take a close look at Tucker Carlson and Piers Morgan and Megyn Kelly and even some of what Candace Owens is doing, I'm not saying they're the best examples of media, but they have a very different scope of what they're willing to talk about versus in mainstream media. And they've talked about how, like, there's a really fascinating conversation between Piers and Tucker where they're talking about 9/11 and they're talking about how it would have been impossible for them to have any freedom to talk about this subject openly and honestly. And that, they were admitting that they never even looked at it properly in the past, but they actually just made fun of everybody who did.
Mhm.
And again, what's important about this is how the culture holds the culture in place. And this is kind of what happens in these media circles is, yes, you have some control. Yes, you have that influence of Operation Mockingbird and ways in which you could have the state effectively kind of influence under various narratives what the media might say. But the ultimate goal is, how do you create a culture that regulates itself? And what mechanisms do you need to put in place to help promote that idea? And that's in large part what happens inside the mainstream media is, and this, to be fair, is now happening inside of alternative media too.
For
And
sure.
it happens through something called audience capture, whereby, somebody builds all of their following and all of their support from a certain audience that is expecting them to say a certain thing. And if they were to ever have to drastically change their mind or tone on something, I mean, sometimes they lose their audience. Or
Yep.
because social media is, you got to keep putting what's viral and what's good and what people will actually watch, it dramatically changes your story selection, or it dramatically changes the narrative you might want to put out there. And in a way that the systems, the platforms themselves are actually regulating what people will and can talk about. So there's, what I'm getting at is there's this really complex relationship as to why we have such, let's say, limited and bad sense making no matter what circle you look in. And it can be anything from money and influence and power and deep state to culture regulating itself, people fearing the loss of job, fearing looking like an idiot, fearing looking like somebody who maybe I just shouldn't ask these questions, but also within themselves, sometimes they won't ask those questions because they don't have the capacity to change their mind because they're too stressed out. So
Mhm.
all of these mechanisms are at play. And this is where it's like, to me, to become more free as a society, we have to gain that capacity and strength as individuals to be willing to move through chaotic times with more resilience, because that's how you stand up to things and do so in a way where we bring people together versus, we go to war with another group of people.
Right. Right. Yeah, it makes me think too, like we live in such an ego-based society as well that you're talking about these complex systems and then you interject ego into
Yeah.
it. And there's a point when someone doesn't want to admit that they were wrong, and they just double down and double down and double down, and then you're on this path that you can't really backtrack from.
Yeah.
And then you throw money and an audience and all that into it, and it's yeah, again, that's where my empathy for them comes from, because I mean, for better or worse, none of the bands I was in, I made it to a certain level, but was never a household name band kind of thing, right? And had that happened, I don't, I like to say that, like, well, I would have stood on my morals and I wouldn't have signed this contract and I wouldn't have done that, but I don't know, because I've never been faced with that.
Yeah.
There's no carrot dangled in front of my face, right? Like, it's just, I have that luxury in a sense to have my own opinions and stuff. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like during the COVID era, that's what I saw the most of, was like, it was sort of just this like self-preservation. Everyone went into self-preservation mode, and preserving the ego, and preserving, not that they were even necessarily aware that that's what they were doing, but it is a survival mechanism, right? Like,
Yeah.
and so I think as people kind of break out of that and it becomes more okay to talk about different topics and stuff, you're now seeing people sort of double down on that. Like, you have Candace Owens, for whatever. I have my opinions on Candace Owens and who's in her circle and who's signing her paychecks kind of thing. But, she broke away from one narrative, turning points or whatever, that's what she was part of, right? Ben Shapiro and all that. She was part of, I think,
Daily Wire, but she also
that's it. Yeah.
She became popular too because of Turning Point USA back in the day.
Yeah. But then, as she breaks away from that and she's now the conspiracy chick, it's like, now she's sort of doubling down on that. And it's, it's kind of a vicious cycle. And I think, again, I think people would be more cognizant of it and more willing to break free from that holding pattern had the last 5 years not been so traumatic for everyone. Because I think there's a lot of people that did take the last 5 years to go inward and, start reading Carl Jung and start doing the things, but to heal the inner child. But, but there's also a lot of people that it just doubled down on their fear, their paranoia, their distrust for people, institutions, whatever. And so you have this like freedom fighter movement. We can get into the Trucker Convoy because I have my opinions on that as well, where, I think the people that were allowed to be the spokespeople for that movement, the poster child for that, were, for lack of a better term, they were kind of fringe. They were, it wasn't, when the media saw who was running the show with that, it just gave them an opportunity to run with it, right? That's what I think is like, well, these people are kind of have sketchy pasts and kind of involved in some weird stuff and have some like really, really steadfast opinions on things. And if we just like let them play to their own ego, we can vilify this entire movement without even lifting a finger. Yeah. And I think that's what happened, honestly.
A lot of selective storytelling on that. And definitely, I remember in the early days talking with, some of the folks involved, and they had this, everybody kind of in the leadership, if you will, a good chunk of them had like their own agendas that went with this. Like some of them wanted Trudeau to step down, and they're to nullify the government essentially. And they had this plan of to what was going to happen next. And then on the flip side, some of them were saying, we just want mandates gone. And then, so there was all these different agendas. And then, there was also, again, there was a group that had a very religious component. And so there was fracturing in different ways in which people saw things, but they were coming together under pretty much like two common things. They were completely fed up with how COVID was handled, and they were absolutely fed up with mandates and what that was doing. And instead of just kind of sticking to those things, which is what unifies everybody, there was this element of like, nah, like it has to be like this. And it's really easy when you're the media and you can pick on, some of the characters there that make videos on YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, and it's awful stuff. You're just like, oh my gosh, right? But to the point of the trucker convoy, like, I so wish, because we were there, our team between Nicole and myself and another employee, like, we were there about 23 of like the 27 or 28 days, or however long the total thing was. It was something like that. So we were there the vast majority of the time. And, for if people could have experienced it, like if they could have just saw what it was actually like on the ground, walking around, being with the people who were there, there's no way the mainstream media's perspective of it could have held up. There's just absolutely no possible way it could have been done. It was the safest, most loving, most organized, most like people actually cared about each other in ways that make, in a way, the government look bad for how they don't accomplish the same unity and the same care for people. Like there was security that within the group that would walk around making sure nothing bad was happening. There was food for free at all times for anybody who wanted or needed food. The homeless were coming there to get food constantly. They had all the driveways, all the streets, all the sidewalks shoveled instantaneously when it snowed. People just came together and made all this stuff happen.
Yeah.
You could strike up a conversation and have a party and have fun with people constantly, right? How many people were troublemakers or were saying things that were unsavory? I don't know, less than 1%, like less than 1%. And the vast majority of the time is when somebody said something like that, or when somebody would go and spit on the mainstream media or try to throw shit at the mainstream media folks, there was like at least 10 people trying to stop them.
Yeah.
You just don't see or hear about this though, right? You just see that like 0.5% that was doing that. And so, there's this element of like, no matter who was there that the media could have focused on, yes, they focused on kind of some of the shittier stuff. But nobody, if they experienced it, could have walked away thinking that the media was telling the truth.
Yeah. Well, that's fair enough. And I remember it was the first time in a while that I kind of felt hopeful about things. And we were talking to Nicole while she was there.
Yeah.
I knew a couple people there, and I agree. Like, I do think ultimately it was like when I say that the media was like, oh, we'll just let this narrative with the leaders I don't think it really affected the vast majority of people, but the people that were already, shitting on the movement and shitting on the, or were pro mandate or whatever, it just gave them ammunition in a big way. And I always, and you see it now with all like, the conservative movement. I don't really like, I'm past the point of taking sides. I understand that left, right, kind of the same thing. It's just, most people, I believe, are fairly centrist at the end of the day. Like everyone just wants like
kind of the same things.
They just want to achieve them in different ways. And I do remember seeing the attempt to like push the grift, with the trucker convoy. There was a big element of that, and that's played out into a lot of the alternative media space now, unfortunately. Like even you look at turning points and things like that. Like it's super grifty. Like,
it is. It's very grifty, and part of the 2016 2017 conversation was, this is my perspective, my theory on it is we saw effectively a massive bait and switch that occurred in alternative media. And
100%.
From 2009 to 2017, let's say, you kind of had Alex Jones was popular. David Icke had his popularity, but he didn't quite have a radio show like Alex Jones. There was like Democracy Now. The Young Turks were kind of getting started. I'm sure there's others that are just not coming to mind, but you didn't, like, you had these brands, but like by the time 2013, 2014, it was, those brands, there was us, like Collective Evolution, we had 30 million viewers a month. We had other colleagues that had the same, or not quite the same, but close to that level of viewership. And like, this was huge. It was like regular people started these media organizations that became very powerful on social media. And we were nonpartisan, most of us. We had ideas for change that were actually outside the system, and sometimes with plans of how we can make the system better while we change the system itself. What people were exposed to was often actually an evolutionary set of ideas. When we all started to get censored in some way, some people there was one day, I think it was something like 770 pages. So Facebook pages, YouTube accounts, and Twitter profiles in the independent media, 770 of them were taken out on the exact same day. So that's coordination between 3 big tech giants to delete the profiles on the exact same day. Now, within that are legitimately what I would call sort of bad actors. Some of these accounts are just, it's purposefully fake news. Like, they're not trying at all to do a good job. It's just, how can I create fake stories and just get away with it? And there's a guy still today who's very popular on X, who was a colleague of ours back then. He's still doing it. He's still creating just purposefully fake stuff, and it's just garbage. But he gets away with it. But also within that was some like satirical or lookalike websites at times too, where they're trying to look like CNN, right? They're trying to look, so it's misleading people. But then within that too was just our literal friends and colleagues who were doing a good job to the best of their ability. And they just lost everything that they had built in just like that. Yeah. And then what started to happen is those who were left were slowly demoted in the algorithm. And, we were in 2019, we were completely removed from Google search. You couldn't find CE in Google search anymore. We used to be the #1 result for like almost any topic. We were completely removed from YouTube search. It would never even suggest collective evolution when you would type it in. I think eventually it came back like 5 years later, but you couldn't do it. We lost our monetization status. AdSense started literally withholding tens of thousands of dollars from us monthly so that we would eventually just leave. There was all these things that happened. And what that did was, as it crashed out, the independent and alternative media that built an audience that was hungry for the independent and alternative media, the opportunists came in. And what was interesting about the opportunists is that they're largely conservative and largely religious. And again, there's nothing wrong with conservatism or religion, let's say, for the sake of this, but that is now the voice that has become so prominent in independent media is conservatism and religion. And so this is now the conversation, and this is how people have slowly but surely, the alternative media went from being this kind of legitimately open-minded, revolutionary in a way thing to now it's like, well, it's kind of just a different mainstream way of seeing things, right? That has many of the same in-group, out-group challenges and ideological bents that are not necessarily helpful to us. And this bait and switch is now in full effect in my eyes, where alternative media is like, it's hard to find a good evolutionary or revolutionary voice that's popular these days.
That doesn't come with backing and funding from someone else, right? Like,
yeah.
I mean, you've
or a narrative, very obvious narrative.
Yeah, you're seeing that. I mean, I always question when someone blows up, overnight. I've been using Ian Carroll as an example because, I don't know Ian Carroll. He might be totally legitimate. He might be a great guy. He seems like a nice dude, but he looks like a Fed. But other than that,
looks like a Fed.
but he blew up overnight, and to where he's a main voice in that space now. And I've seen it just happen again and again, and I think you're 100% right, is that that audience was built and then the infrastructure for that audience was wiped away, but the audience still existed and they had to go somewhere. You swoop. It's like the people that at a casino and they scope out the slot machines and wait for someone to go because they've counted the amount of spins they've done. They know that the next 5 it's going to win. It's going to pay out.
Yeah.
It's that.
This is
And
how
problem
major
solution thing too.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, this
just
is how major corporations, I mean, operate within the product industry all the time. They just watch these alternative, like clean companies take all the risk, do all the startup, build the audience, and then they just swoop in and buy them, right?
Yeah.
And this is kind of the same approach if you're a money making sort of businessy kind of person. It's like, oh shit, there's a lot of audience there. Let me just get in there, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and so you said that the like the shadow banning and the censorship and stuff is kind of eased up.
Yeah.
Do you think it's just because they know that people have found their space now, and people are kind of in their groups, so we can ease up? And then do you think it's going to come back? I think is my main question is now that there's all these alternative spaces that have their narratives, if we were to, say build up this alternative media space again and collective evolution I don't know what your readership is like now, but say, you get 30, 50 million readers a month. Do you see them backtracking and putting that stuff back in place, or are we past that as a collective to where we're not going to fall for that again?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the kind of the pros and cons of what's happening now within media and how it might affect various generations in terms of what they're seeing. And I think one of the, the pros to what happened during COVID, let's say, is that so many people saw very clearly, okay, my gut and what I'm seeing tells me there's something not quite right about the way, let's say, mainstream media is handling this subject. Like people who always, would typically trust government, who would trust what the media said. We heard time and time and time and time again, these are people that in no way are part of the alternative communities. They're just regular folks. Time again, they would say, I don't trust government anymore. I don't trust mainstream media. Like there's something wrong here. And so again, that censorship or hearing of the way things were handled and kind of seeing it for yourself acted like a catalyst for them to go, hold on a second, something's wrong. And so even in these darkest, let's say, censorship, sort of demonetization eras, we have the opportunity for change. And that opportunity for change can sometimes come in the form of, it's not perfect, but somebody like Elon buying X and going, let's see if we can do it differently. Has it been perfect? No. I mean, they're still pushing algorithm based on rage bait for the most part, but is there a little bit less problems? Probably. And this remains to be seen, right? Like it takes a lot of effort to kind of figure this out, but you could say, are people questioning things more now than before? Yeah, they still are. So something is working. Is it being done in a way where it's grounded and we're feeling good about it? Maybe not, right? So that's a challenge. Likewise with Facebook, like we did, I think it was something like 700 million views of content on Facebook in the month of November. A view on Facebook doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as a view on YouTube, but the point being, we also had, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of points of engagement, right? Like close to 1 million points of engagement. So it's like in 1 month, because of how much Facebook has changed in the last like 2 years, we have reach back. We have the ability for people to see our content. Again, it's not perfect, but it's actually a lot better than it was in, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022. So there's improvement, and you see Zuckerberg is kind of going to the community notes model. You see that Zuckerberg is trying to potentially kind of open things up and allow it to be a little bit less, constraining. And I think it's because too, like these people are human. I think to some extent Zuckerberg does care about his legacy and how people view him, and like, does he want to be a stalwart for censorship, or does he want to be a guy that is actually doing a good thing? And I'm not saying he's perfect. I'm not saying he's not corruptible, but I'm also saying I leave space for the possibility that if you look closely at Facebook, even though he's at the top, sometimes you hire people whose previous job was at some government agency. They come in and they're actually low key inserting things and doing things that are actually passing info back to the intelligence community, but they're also then effectuating policy that is not necessarily beneficial. And sometimes as CEO, can you put that all together right away when you're running a billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar company and doing all the things you're doing? Maybe not, right? So again, I think even within these companies, it can be so compartmentalized and tricky. And maybe he started to figure out that, shit, this is not going in the direction that I want. I'm going to change a few things. I don't know. That's the thing, is how do we know? All I can say is that at the end of the day, I'm watching Facebook become a better platform than it was a few years ago. And that's worth talking about. Is it perfect? No. Does it still have a lot of algorithmic problems? Yeah. Does it still promote rage bait? Yeah. But we're getting a lot of audience. So that's good.
Yeah. Well, I think it's sort of in response to platforms like, what was it, like Telegram or Telegraph or whatever that one was.
Telegram. Yeah.
Yeah. Discord, things like that, right? Where people are having a little more open source conversation and idea sharing, right? So I think they had to adapt, in my opinion. They kind of didn't really have a choice. People were on to the grift, and so I mean, I'm kind of the mindset too, where I don't really care what instigates the change as long as it changes in the right way. Like if a bunch of bad people get scared into like being better people, that's a net positive to me. I don't really. So it is interesting that platforms like Facebook and stuff are actually becoming usable again. Because in my opinion, like I deleted my Facebook account years ago because I was just like, there's no point to this. This is just boomers barking. That's all I'm seeing, right? So
there is an element to that still. But even look at YouTube. Like YouTube was pretty rough at one point with regard to the way they treated creators and certain topics. I mean, but yet look at some of them now that, again, like some of these topics, some of this information is thriving on YouTube. Is it perfect? No, but it's better than it was. And it's not to say that there aren't still narrative engineering going on, that there's not still some level of censorship on certain topics. It's just not as bad as it was. And like, there's something to be said about recognizing that. And I always like to offer people like the idea of like, if we get to a point as people, because this happens a fair amount in the alternative community, call it being blackpilled, where we don't have that hope, we don't see the possibility of something better emerging, and that no matter what, we always feel that the agenda, whatever's happening that looks good, is bad. If that is always the default, then that's not really promising, is it? That doesn't really put us in a position where we can do much of anything.
Right.
So even if it were true that that's what was happening, we don't benefit from sticking to that narrative, because any chance you have at changing it is basically destroyed through the defeatist attitude of like, there's nothing we can do. Right. Whereas if, and I actually think it's likely that things are changing. It's more likely that things are changing than they're not. Then we at least hold the optimism, the hopefulness, and the ability to see that, hey, with the right pressure, with the right choice, with the right consciousness of people making different choices, we can change these systems that are trying to invite us into things that we don't necessarily like. And it's an individual thing. As individuals, when we make these choices and live these ways, that's how we model to other people that there's a different option. And yeah, it doesn't change overnight, but we also don't have the individual, or even like 5 people can't get together and just fully take down the system that we have, right? It has to happen by people slowly changing at the ground level with where we are at right now. So I think there's an element of just being careful within ourselves as people who are, looking at alternative media a lot. Do I leave space? Do I leave openness for things to happen that are actually good and that are actually changing? And how would I recognize if we're making progress? Like, what would that actually look like? And how would I know? Because oftentimes we don't ask those questions and we're not sure where we're at and where we're headed. And if we're not careful, it can look like it's all bad. Um, and that doesn't necessarily feel good, nor put us in a position to make change.
Yeah.
No, I think what I've been seeing and happy to see over the last little while on social media is that there's been more discussion between groups,
Mm,
and I think discussion's the way forward. And I've seen a bit more nuance.
yeah,
Like instead of very black and white, like it's
Yeah.
this or that, people are starting to have more nuanced opinions, and just normal people, not just
yeah,
influencers. You know what I mean? And I think that's a way forward as well, because
absolutely.
that is the world, right? Nuance. I think we've lost nuance in the last 20 years, 30 years.
I'm curious to
As the
like,
older guy here,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah, no, for sure. Like, I agree.
Yeah.
It used to be a lot easier to talk to people about things, and even, people that I, that there was mutual respect between, that you could just see their eyes glaze over sometimes when you get to a certain topic, right? And I think we need to, and
Mhm.
what I wanted to bring up, what is curious to me is like a lot of what we've been talking about is American platforms, very like US centric personalities and whatever. Um, do you see it? Is media in Canada following that same trend, like, or are we behind here? Because I always find a stark difference between, like, for being neighbors, neighboring
Mhm.
countries. The way Canadians think is so different than the way Americans think, and the way we approach media, the way we approach problems, the way we approach like social issues and things like that is a lot more, the more go along to get along kind of thing, and less of a, maybe we just ask less questions, and that's what it is. But I guess my main question to you would be that as you see media and these platforms moving away from censorship and stuff, is that being followed in Canada, or are we still, under the CBC thumb? Uh, because I know, like, I don't know if it's still the case, but there was you weren't able to even share news in Canada on Facebook at one point, right? Is that still a thing?
Yeah, I would say that that's probably the worst thing that is going on in Canada right now still, that's in my mind right now, coming to mind, without looking at everything, is that there is still a policy in place where, yeah, certain brands, like, you can't view them on Instagram and Facebook. We managed to get around that because we didn't classify ourselves as a news media
Okay.
company. So anybody in Canada can still see all of our stuff. So, it's that simple to kind of get around it. That said, um, it is silly. I don't think that Canada is gaining anything by doing this policy. And I think they might have hoped that they would gain something in terms of money from some of these companies, or perhaps somehow trying to big up Canadian content, as they're always trying to do, even though they can't define what Canadian content is.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
this is part of the whole thing. The question, I'm reluctant to kind of be able to provide too much of an answer on the question about US and Canada, because it's something I feel like I'd have to think about in more detail. But my gut responses coming up are things like, I don't think the challenges we have here in Canada are as big as the challenges that people have in the States. Like, the there is a different history in the United States, and that history is something they're very patriotic about, and it's something that they're also taught very, very deeply. Like, it is a different culture in a way, and that culture and that history and the repetition of that does shape, for example, the way they view fighting for something, right?
Right.
And so anytime there's a political issue, you're going to have more of that response because it's more in the culture of how they respond to things that are of the body politic. Whereas in Canada, its history is not quite the same, and we're not taught this, and we're not brought up on like this fighting, fighting, fighting. Um, and at the same time, because I think we have some of the policies and different things we have in this country versus in the United States, we generally have better results as a society for things like health and, overall intelligence and overall ability to get along, and kind of see the common good in things. That doesn't mean the country's perfect by any means, but it's to say I think we are living a different experience. Like I've spent enough time in the US to kind of see and experience and feel that difference. Previous relationship I was in for 8 years, she was from Arizona. And so I spent a good chunk of time, and you inevitably hear a lot about, America because you're just so close to it. And it is, yeah, it is different. And so while I'm reluctant to say like, are we, you specifically said like, are we just kind of going along with it? Um, and there may be fighting and asking more questions, and we're potentially asking less questions. There might be an element to that, like where maybe we ask a little bit less questions sometimes because we just want to get along. I think that could be part of the Canadian identity, but I also don't know if it's producing really bad results yet. That for what I mean by that, compared to the kinds of results we're seeing in countries who we might say are asking more questions. Like I'm not sure that the United States is producing changes that are like sweepingly better than what we're seeing already in a lot of other developed countries.
Yeah.
So I'd have to think about this in more detail to answer beyond that, but that's like my initial gut overview kind of thought.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah, it always just, that because there's always been that difference between there's a Canadian production, you can kind of tell it's Canadian,
Oh yeah.
and you know,
That's more of
um
just, less
Hmm.
talent.
yeah, I suppose, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, less money, less talent, less everything.
Yeah.
Huh.
But yeah, no, I just I hope, I guess my hope is that Canadians do start asking more questions, because we started this show, and we haven't, we've only been doing it for a few months. But you're the first Canadian that I've reached out to outside of Mike's brother that's agreed to do the show.
Nice.
And that to me that says something, right? Like almost every American guest I've reached out to has been like, yeah, man, I'm down. Let's have a chat.
Yeah.
Let's have a conversation. And Canadians are like, I don't know if I really want to, like, I don't know, so there is that hesitation there still. And it's, yeah. So I do hope that there's like that there is a evolutionary thing that happens up here. Maybe we're just a little bit behind, like we tend to be behind in trends and stuff. So maybe that is just part of it. And we're a smaller country, more spaced out. I mean, yeah,
I think our British heritage to like not everyone, but
Well,
I mean,
yeah.
the country,
Yeah.
and we generally trust the government more. I would say, like, we have more trust for the government than America does,
Yeah.
as a whole from the beginning, right?
Well, we're not on the world stage, like starting wars every few years. I think,
Yes.
we're doing other stuff. It's not like we're not,
Yeah,
playing our
we're not
part.
perfect.
No.
No.
Yeah. But we're a lot less, abrasive than the United States
Yep.
is. So I think that people just assume that things are kind of okay,
Mhm.
even though they're not,
Mhm.
So yeah,
Yeah. Every
I
every
don't know.
every country I would think has their challenges. Like you look at some of the Scandinavian countries, which have great results in a lot of different areas, and look at some of the stuff that's happening with their cultures, as they've had a lot of really fast immigration or refugee type crises that have occurred there, and it's making things challenging in some way. But at the same time, they do a whole bunch of other things really well, and you're like, how do we pick and choose what to focus on and what to look at, and how we decide which country is doing it the best? Or it's tough, and that's why I'm reluctant to answer it. Is one, I haven't looked at it deeply enough, but two, I just get a general sense of like, it reminded me of this. People would talk to me during COVID. Being you guys may have had this experience, and maybe you would answer this question differently than me. But I knew what things were like in the States because I know a lot of people in the States, and I would talk to them, and they're friends of mine who think similarly to me in the sense that we could just talk openly and honestly and not have hyperbole and just, just talk it out. So you
Yeah.
get a good sense of what things were like in different areas of the States during COVID, and I knew what the experience was like living here in Ontario with COVID. And people would often message going like, "Holy crap, you're in a prison camp. Like, how are you even living day to day? Like, how are you surviving? Like, Canada is the worst country in the world." And I'd be like, I'm like, I get where your perspective's coming from, and yeah, we have this really stupid thing where if you're unvaccinated, you can't get on a plane or a ferry or travel or do anything. Like, it's nuts. But like, what's your life like there right now? And they would explain it, and oh yeah, going in, I have to wear a mask into here. I gotta, do this there. I gotta do that. I'm like, right. I'm like, that's exactly what our life is like here. Like, it's not that different. Like, we're
Yeah.
other than having to listen to Trudeau sometimes, which wasn't the most fun thing to do. Um, that one mandate that was awful, like legitimately probably the worst thing Canada's ever done. I
Mhm.
don't want to say that abrupt. Like, obviously, there's really bad things they've done, but that was in my lifetime, it's one of the worst things they've ever done.
Yeah.
But outside of that, our day to day was almost identical to so many Americans that I know. Where you'd get up, you'd go out, you'd go into places, you'd wear a mask, you'd do things. Maybe you said, "No, I'm not wearing a mask." Maybe they say, "Yes, you can come in." Maybe they say, "Yes, you can." Right? It was
Yeah.
similar day to day, right? But
Mhm.
the perspective was that we were in a communist prison camp because that is what the story that was, kind of put out there. And so why I say like, yeah, people might answer this question differently. Like, I just looked at like, what am I actually doing and how am I living day to day? And how different is that to the perspective? And that's why it can be so hard because, we hear these narratives of other places like, and we're just not sure until we live there, like what it's actually like. But I'm curious, like what I described about my experience in Canada, like, do you guys relate to that or would you describe it differently for COVID?
I found it. I found it that like I viewed it as a psychological operation a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the time. Is that it was very
Yep.
dehumanizing and
Yep.
very demoralizing, but the actual physical effect on my life, yeah, like you said, it really wasn't that great. I would walk into the store without a mask and you get a couple looks or whatever, but at the end of the day, it's like I never once was approached
Yeah.
and no one told me to that mandate, the no travel thing, because I live in
Yep.
a different province than my family. That one hit. That was
Yep.
like, oh, I'm not allowed to go see my family now. Like
Yeah.
for a personal decision. So to me, that was the main like demoralization part of it. And yeah, it wasn't so much that there was a prison. It felt like I was in a prison. It felt like that was the point when I was like, oh, I don't know if there's hope for change here. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
if is this just setting precedence for where we're headed
Yeah.
rather than is this being a momentary temporary thing. It was like my fear was like, no, we're just going to keep getting more draconian with this stuff and we're just going to
Yeah.
it's going to keep getting worse. And because Canadians weren't speaking up in the same way that Americans were up until the trucker
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
protests, for sure, because nowhere else in the world did that. Like we
Yeah.
set precedence in that, which was
Right.
really, really cool. One of the
Yeah.
coolest things that's happened in Canada in my lifetime. Um,
Yes.
but yeah, that would be my main thing is it was more just this like hopelessness, kind of fear, survival mode thing that still comes up.
Mhm.
My wife lost 2 careers during that.
Mm-hmm.
She worked in film and she was no longer allowed to work on film sets.
Yeah.
She worked, and then her other job, she's a costume designer and worked in clothing and stuff. So,
Mm-hmm.
and the clothing company she was working for, like, had layoffs and stuff. So it was very much like it was a heavy, heavy time that
Yeah.
still affects the way, like, I know she catches herself with work stuff now, being paranoid that for some reason that she's going to lose another job, and with me, it's like, I lost a lot of friends in the music scene because the art scene tends to be very left leaning and was very pro vaccine and stuff,
Yeah.
which I thought was just ridiculous for a bunch of punk rock people to, all of a sudden be bootlickers was
Yeah.
really odd to me. But, um, Yeah, so it was the loss of hope, and so I always viewed it as less of an attack, a physical attack on humanity, and more of a psychological attack on everyone.
Yeah.
I agree with what both of you has said. For me, I kind of went through the same things as you and the same things as your wife.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to get too into that, but I will say for me, I did have hope with the Freedom Convoy as well, because the two things, like the vaccine mandate is the worst thing that I've seen since I've been alive down to the people.
Yeah.
But on the other side of it, the Freedom Convoy, or the Trucker Convoy, was the kind of the happiest and proudest I've been too, right? And those two things happen because of each other. And I did think, I hope that it would end it right away. It did take a bit of time, right? Because it didn't end until May or June, I think, after the convoy. But it did give me hope at a time where I couldn't believe the vaccine mandate went on, and I couldn't believe how many people followed it. I couldn't believe how many people that I knew were friends of mine who were so happy to go to the pub because they had their shot, knowing that I did not.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And how many arguments I had with people and friends that I lost and still haven't spoken to because of it.
So I was living in Vancouver during all that. We live on the island now, but I was living in East Vancouver, so like right in the heart of the city kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so strange because there was a restaurant that refused to check the vaccine cards and stuff and was just letting people in and was very outspoken and no, you can come. This is like, come here. So my wife and I went because it had been a year since we'd even sat in a restaurant kind of thing or been around like-minded people. Because we were living in an apartment. Everyone in the apartment was wearing masks in the hallway. And so it was really weird, really dystopian and weird. But we went for dinner at this place and it felt normal again for like one night. And I remember saying to my wife, like, I can't believe that sitting down to eat a pizza is an act of rebellion right now. Like, how absurd is this? We're just, it's a Friday night and we're sitting down to eat a pizza and drink a beer. And it's like, we could be arrested. Like, it's just, you know what I mean? It's just a silly, silly thing. And I think that eventually it started to hit people like that, where it's like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
This is ridiculous.
We had those gathering in British Columbia. We weren't only allowed to have 4 people and then gathered in our home at a time. And we would have 20, 30, 40 people over and have a bonfire, and felt the same way. Like, we're rebels.
But you're just
for having
it's a Friday night.
And smoking a couple doobies and having some beers. It was crazy to even think that was only 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Huh. But it puts a stain on what people view as normal, right? So like everyone, they kept saying, I really hated the
new normal.
The new normal, the phrases that were, safe and effective. Oh, it's just shut up, people. But I even today, like the amount of people that still reference COVID. Oh, during COVID. Oh, during COVID. COVID. It's like it became it's its own thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's its own like piece of history now, and that to me is just really absurd because I mean I believe it was all based on a lie. So it's for it to affect people at such a core level, even still, and a lot of people will affect the rest of their lives and how they approach society is over something that may or may not have been real at all.
Mm-hmm.
Is just it really opened my eyes to how suggestible people are, and B, just like how many people are searching for a savior and just searching for someone to tell them what's what. Like that, like, that lack of discernment, that lack of like consciousness, like simply unaware of who they are, because if you know who you are and you can, then everything goes through a filter, right? Like, and the amount of people that lack that internal dialogue or that filter just kind of blew my mind.
Isn't it only 60 or 70% of people have internal dialogue or something like that?
That's
might even be less than that. I was amazed that not everyone did, but anyway.
Yeah.
Well, the interesting part of all that for me is like the experiences that you guys described, and like I know people who lost jobs as well. It's like, this is what was going on in almost every country. There was like, let's say Florida in the United States and Sweden that had a totally different approach. But these sorts of things were happening everywhere. And it's interesting that the worst thing produced the greatest thing here in Canada.
Yeah.
Right. That mandate produced the moment that so many people were like, okay, enough, right? And did the Freedom Convoy, and the media has tried their version of framing that event and talking about it. And my experience, largely has been, and um, I like to use people in this example that weren't followers of alternative media. They weren't already people questioning things. Like, I know so many people whose, their moment of I don't trust the government was, either those mandates or seeing the convoy or seeing how things were handled during COVID. And I always go back to it, and it's like, well, it can be like tricky, like shit. Like, there's still so many people that don't question things. There's way more people questioning things now than there was pre-COVID. And there's way more people questioning things now than back in 2009 when I was starting and looking at how things were done. And so I do think there's a catalyst of within these events. The other key question is this, and this is the part that is a little bit more complex, but is worth talking about, which is people can start questioning things, but just because we're questioning it, are we really getting to the root of like what's going on and having an understanding of what, let's say, the problems we face really are? Because to bring about any solution to a problem, like, we have to be able to clearly define it. And this is where the nuance comes in, and why the culture of complexity is so important, is because, in the United States, let's say, and I don't know if this is true for sure, but they might have more people who are questioning things. But are they asking the right questions, and are they really getting to the root of the problem? And there might be less people questioning things here, but the people who are, or perhaps the society as a whole, has a bit of a deeper understanding of what some of our challenges might be. And in those cases, you might actually have one set of one country or one set of people that maybe they don't question things enough, but they just have a deeper understanding of kind of what some of the problems are. And that might actually be further ahead than a group of people who are questioning everything, but there's no solidity or there's no clear understanding of what's going on. And that's what polarization and hyperbole can create, is this idea that we're questioning things, but we don't necessarily have clarity as to what's going on. So this is where it's like, I don't know the answer of which country or this whatever might have more of that, but I always just like to look at it in terms of clarity. Like, who seems to have more clarity, let's say, or at least is open to clarity? And I don't know how to answer that question right now. But what I do feel, and this is kind of where I think it's also worth mentioning, is that we talked at one point about how, most people want the same things. And I remember, I think this was in and around 2019 or 2020, there was a graph essentially that came out, and it was attempting through a whole bunch of research and data to like put the United States' political spectrum on a graph. And it kind of alluded to the fact that there's like 10% of unmovable lefties, there's 10% of unmovable righties, and everybody else is sort of somewhere along the path, and they're movable. 80% of people are movable. And on social media, we mostly hear from the 10 on either side, which actually gives us a skewed understanding of who's out there. And so this is the other piece to it where I'm like, where really are we? Like, when I have conversations with, let's say, a lot of my parents are boomers, a lot of their friends are boomers, a good chunk of my cousins and my aunts and uncles are boomers. I like to call them boom boxes. And when I have conversations with them, they all see the world strikingly different now than before COVID. And I'm not saying all of them are like perfectly on board with clarity, but they're like, yeah, they most of them question things. And none of them are extreme on either of those ends. Whereas when I talk to somebody who's extreme on either of those ends, I'm like, actually, even though we agree on some of these topics, I don't think there's clarity over what the actual issues are. And so this is why it's like, it's a hard question to answer.
Yeah, it is, and yeah, it's easy to not see the other side of it too. Because while I say, like, I'm talking about people's like personalities changing throughout that period and whatever, affecting how they make decisions now, but it's not like that on the other end of it hasn't affected me too, right? Like, I have to stop myself and be like, okay, no, it's like they just have an opinion. They have,
Yeah.
you know, this is where they're coming from. This is their perspective. This is where they're getting their information. Not everyone's out to like, not everyone wants to throw you in a camp, dude. It's okay.
Yeah.
You know, you got to kind of
Yeah.
pump the brakes a little bit, because
Yeah.
the same way it affects how they view things, it's like, yeah, it's stained my psyche as well. So it's like everyone has to heal now. It's not just
Mm-hmm.
the lefties that need to heal and the conservatives have it figured out and know what family means and blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, you guys are angry as hell too. Like we all need to kind of collectively figure this
Yeah.
out and meet somewhere in the middle. You're always going to have the fringes and the extremes, you know, on either side. But I think that's just, and obviously squeaky wheel gets the grease. So a lot of the time that's the loudest voice wins. So that's, I understand that. But it is interesting to hear that it is like 80%, the movable part is like, I always figured that most people are centrists, but the flexibility I didn't necessarily think was that stark, you know, like that. Yeah.
Yeah, like look
Yeah.
at the last election. And like think of how many, unless, you know, you could be open to the possibility that somehow the whole thing was rigged. Okay. That's fine too. But look at how many people, if it wasn't rigged, would have been on the left but voted for Trump. Like it would have been a lot of people. And it doesn't mean that the people who voted for Kamala couldn't have been convinced to vote for Trump. But you know, there's a lot of people who voted for Trump that would have come from that left side. So it's a really sort of fascinating discussion at the end of the day, and we're talking about a character, let's say in Trump, who can be hard to like in many ways, and in other ways you can like him. Like I get it, but that election was pretty telling, I think, of just kind of what makes up society sometimes. And I think in Canada, given our agreeability is probably a bit higher, yeah, we are split between three parties, kind of in a way, so it's a little different. But imagine you just ripped out the NDP for a second, and you were just like, wow, there's the Liberals and the Conservatives. And to be fair, Conservatives here are not the same as Conservatives in the States. Conservatives here are more like Liberals in the States. But, it's like, but it's like they're probably pretty damn movable here as well. So I think it'd be reasonable to think that data from the U.S. would probably apply here too.
I think that's how the last election turned out. I thought there would be a lot more people vote. I didn't. It's turned out the way I thought, but leading into it, before the whole Trump is bad thing in the Canadian election, I thought it was going to be a conservative landslide, and they got a lot of those people in the middle to move and vote liberal, like the guy we were speaking about before.
Yeah.
In that conversation,
he's a conservative guy.
A conservative, and he said he voted liberal because the liberals can handle Donald Trump, and I don't think that Pierre Poilievre can.
Yeah,
is what he said. Yeah,
whatever.
So and I was shocked to hear that. I thought, oh, this election for sure, people will vote conservative just because of how horribly everything's been handled, and it didn't happen.
Yeah. Well, and at the end of the day, people shifted towards sort of the more watered down candidate, right? Like, the devil, like, well, this guy's he's not like a clear doofus like Trudeau was. Like, that guy's, I mean, he's insufferable to people who even have liberal views. Like, he's, hard to listen to. But Carney, I get it. He's sort of unassuming, as long as you don't, look into his history and who his friends are. But I totally, I was again, like, it's funny too, because I was upset about the like results and upset that like people voted liberal that probably would have voted conservative or whatever. And then at the same time, I had to sit back and I'm like, yeah, but you don't even believe in the system, period. Like, I didn't even vote. So what do I care? Like but again, it's like, it's that psychological operation. It's even for those that are aware, it's so easy to get sucked into it because you are part of the collective, whether you like to admit it or not. So
what happens out there does matter because it affects us. And we often see like to frame solutions to the challenges we have in a way where you have short-term in-system solutions and short-term out-system solutions and long-term in-system solutions and long-term out-system solutions. And the thing is, like, yeah, sometimes it's like, I don't really believe in the system that we have. Obviously it needs to fundamentally change in my view. But there are certain short-term in-system things I might participate in that could be helpful in the short term. But to be able to hold that long term, like, what do we actually want to create? Where do we want to go? What is the system design that's producing the negative results that none of us really like? That conversation has to be alive. It has to be really alive, and it's just not alive as much as it needs to be in our world right now because we get so focused on short-term in-system solutions. It's always like, this is the greatest crisis. We have to solve this right now. Once that's done, then we'll worry about, these long-term out-system solutions. It's like, no, the long-term out system is how we know where we're going and how to get there. And that again feeds back into the bait and switch that I believe happened is we used to have a lot of long-term out system solution conversation that was rummaging around the alternative sphere. Like, you guys remember Peter Joseph and Zeitgeist, right? Like, and like this was like the era of long-term out system was him and Jacques Fresco. And, there was a lot of, energy around that kind of thing. And that was alternative media, right? Like, that was alternative thinking. And now it's like everybody's focused in on these short-term, like, little things that happen week to week. And hey, it won out again, right? So I think that movement back to the bigger picture, back to taking a moment to realize that, there is not actually a crisis that we have to solve today. And that orientation might just be a trained response. And it doesn't mean that there aren't things that need fixing. It's just that there's a difference between a crisis that involves our nervous system to feel survival and panic, and something that actually is like, we need to be clear-headed to think about the big picture because that's what we're faced with. So
no, that's a really, that's a brilliant way of kind of framing it, the short in-system solutions and stuff. I've never really thought of it that way. So I always just view it as distraction, but there are legitimate short-term problems that people are trying to solve. And that's,
So essentially take a deep breath, zoom out and see how everything is.
Yeah. I think it all comes down to priorities a lot of the time, right? Like, it's just, it's, and everyone's priorities are different. So if we can find a more of a collective priority to attack first, it might be the best. It's a slower way, slower way forward, I guess, but a more stable way forward. Because my concern is just that things just descend into chaos. That's always like, that's not obviously, like, revolutions happen and things happen out of war and stuff like that. Sometimes positive changes to society, but I feel like as a collective, like, we kind of, at some point, we got to move past bloodshed and destruction as a way to drive change. Like, we should find a more sustainable way of doing that.
I mean, what we can say is right now we have all the means of communicating, all the means of technology to create a transition or a change that is meaningful. The question is do we hold as individuals and thus a collective the conditions to steward those technologies and those things effectively? And of course, we can't answer that question for other people. We can only answer it for ourselves. And so that's where it goes back to change starts within. This is where I get a bit emotional, but it's like, at the end of the day, that's the choice we have to make as individuals is, do we want to be that model, for something better? But that's what it comes down to. You embrace that, we will slowly make the change on a collective level.
No, for sure. I think that's a really, maybe a positive note to kind of wrap this thing up on, leave the people with some hope and stuff. So I think, and I thank you for doing what you're doing over at Collective Evolution and taking that reasoned approach to everything. I think it's direly needed right now, and I think you're doing good work.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
I'm glad to have found you, and you have a follower now for sure for life. It's a
Beauty.
great website. Enjoy your articles a lot.
Yeah, thanks.
And
we're
they
hoping
resonate
to
very.
Yeah, and we're hoping to try and pick her back up even more in the coming year here. There's been a bit of a hiatus with a big transition year, but yeah, it'll pick up.
Right on. Well, I guess on that note, maybe if you wouldn't mind, just let the people know where they can find your work, and any closing thoughts and final words here.
Yeah, I mean, Collective Evolution is and the Pulse are two platforms. Pulse is mainly on Substack. You can find it at thepulse.one. Collective Evolution is collective-evolution.one .com. And we're also on socials. Mainly, we focus on Instagram, Facebook right now. We also have YouTube channels for both that we're going to be getting going again. So all of that can be found. But yeah, that's basically where to find it. And I just, at the end of the day, I guess the closing message was what I said previously that got me weeping there, which is just I think sometimes we underestimate how important it is for us to just be that model, like because it can feel sometimes shitty when you're like, but will everybody else change? It doesn't matter. Question is, can we do it? Right? Can we do it? And so that's it. Yeah, that's how she goes.
Right on. Well, wise words.
Great advice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Joe Martino, everybody, Collective Evolution, hit him up, give him a follow, and start reading. I'm excited to see the ramp up again. That'll be cool.
Yeah, and thanks so much for having me on the show.
Yeah, anytime, man. Oh, seriously, anytime.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So, thanks everyone for tuning in. I'll let Mike do his little tagline.
Yeah, from the land of the high seas and the tall trees. I'm Mike.
I'm Andrew.
Have a great night.
We'll catch you next time. Thank you.